When America's richest mansions were conceived, they were not imagined as permanent drains on private fortune. They were built with a financial premise that now feels counterintuitive, that estates of extraordinary scale could, over time, pay for themselves. This belief did not arise from arrogance or naivete, but from the economic logic of a specific moment in American history. When wealth behaved differently, money moved more slowly, and land could still function as a stabilizing system rather than a speculative asset. At the turn of the 20th century, the United States experienced an unprecedented concentration of private capital. Industrialization compressed decades of wealth formation into a single generation. Railroads, energy, steel finance, and extraction produced cash flows that exceeded the capacity of existing institutions to manage them efficiently. For those at the top, the challenge was not accumulation, but containment. Banks were fragile, markets were volatile, and legal frameworks for capital preservation were incomplete. Extreme wealth required a structure capable of absorbing it without amplifying risk. The mansion-based estate emerged as that structure. It offered a way to convert abstract financial power into a tangible system governed by slower, more predictable forces. Land did not panic. Buildings did not reprice overnight. Agricultural cycles followed seasons rather than markets. Forestry followed decades rather than quarters. In this environment, slowness was not inefficiency. It was insulation. A sufficiently large estate could smooth consumption, internalize labor, and reduce exposure to external price shocks, creating the appearance of financial autonomy. This is why so many grand estates were designed not merely as residences, but as territorial systems. They incorporated farmland, forests, workshops, housing, and infrastructure intended to reduce reliance on outside markets. The house itself functioned as an administrative and symbolic center, while the surrounding land formed an economic buffer. The estate was meant to operate as a closed, or semi-closed loop, where money circulated internally long enough to justify the scale of investment. In America, where aristocratic land traditions were weak or absent, these estates served an additional purpose. They transformed newly accumulated industrial wealth into something that resembled permanence. Land ownership carried social legitimacy, political influence, and an aura of continuity that financial assets alone could not provide. The mansion anchored wealth in place, signaling that it was disciplined, orderly, and intended to endure. This mattered in a society still negotiating the meaning of private power on such a scale. Few estates embody this logic as clearly as Biltmore Estate. Often described simply as a mansion, it was conceived as a managed economic landscape. Thousands of acres were assembled not for ornament, but for production and control. Agriculture, forestry, and labor were organized to reduce cash outflows and stabilize long-term costs. The expectation was not that the estate would generate spectacular profits, but that it would neutralize volatility and absorb surplus in a way that felt rational and defensible. This expectation rested on assumptions that, at the time, were widely shared. There was no federal income tax. Property taxation was modest. Labor markets were local and weakly regulated. Environmental constraints were minimal. Under these conditions, scale reduced uncertainty. The larger the system, the more it could internalize costs, recycle wages, and plan across long horizons. What appears extravagant in hindsight functioned as risk management in context. The belief that estates could pay for themselves did not mean they were expected to operate independently of external wealth. Industrial and financial income continued to subsidize them, but the estate was meant to reduce dependence on those flows over time, lowering household expenses, stabilizing operations, and preserving capital. Across generations, losses were tolerable as long as they were predictable. Inefficiencies were acceptable as long as they bought stability. Prestige reinforced this model. Large estates signaled permanence to banks, peers, and political actors. Visibility functioned as reputational collateral, supporting the broader financial systems that generated the wealth in the first place. The mansion did not merely consume money. It helped legitimize it, anchoring abstract capital in physical form. At the moment these estates were built, the promise that they could sustain themselves was not delusional. It was aligned with the structure of the economy, the behavior of capital, and the limits of regulation. The financial logic was coherent, disciplined, and widely accepted among those who possessed extreme wealth. That logic, however, depended on conditions that would not remain stable. The same scale that once reduced risk would later magnify it, and the same permanence that legitimized wealth would eventually attract pressures it could not absorb. If you want to understand how the money that built these estates was actually made in the first place, let me know and I'll continue. The belief that America's richest mansions could eventually pay for themselves only made sense because the money that built them arrived with unusual consistency and scale. These estates were not funded by sporadic windfalls or speculative gains. They were financed by economic systems that generated predictable surplus year after year, often insulated from competition and lightly constrained by regulation. The mansion was not the engine of wealth creation. It was the downstream structure that captured and reorganized the output of far larger machines. At the center of this process stood infrastructure capitalism. Railroads, utilities, and extractive industries formed the backbone of late 19th century American wealth. These sectors did not operate like modern competitive markets. They were systems of necessity. Railroads determined which regions could participate in national commerce and at what cost. Once tracks were laid, pricing power followed geography rather than demand. Freight moved regardless of business cycles because goods still had to travel. Passenger traffic expanded with population growth. Revenues scaled with the nation itself, while marginal costs declined over time. Ownership within these systems produced a distinct kind of income. Dividends and interest payments arrived regularly, often buffered by long-term contracts and monopoly-like control over routes and regions. Trusts and holding companies aggregated assets across vast territories, smoothing local fluctuations and concentrating surplus at the top. For families embedded in these structures, income felt less like profit and more like entitlement. It was assumed, planned for, and relied upon. The same logic applied to energy and heavy industry. Coal, steel, oil, and electricity expanded alongside urbanization and industrial growth. Demand was structural rather than discretionary. Regulation was minimal. Labor protections were weak. Owners captured a disproportionate share of output, converting scale into compounding surplus. By the time mansions entered the picture, much of this wealth already exceeded what could be efficiently redeployed into additional industrial expansion without increasing risk. Financial markets amplified this accumulation while simultaneously encouraging diversification away from them. Securities markets enabled rapid capital growth, but they were prone to violent panics. Liquidity could disappear overnight. Banks failed with little warning. For those holding extreme wealth, this volatility created an incentive to move a portion of capital into assets governed by slower dynamics. Land and estates did not promise superior returns, but they promised continuity. They absorbed money without reacting sharply to shocks. This is where the mansion-based estate became relevant. It functioned as a container for surplus rather than a source of it. Converting industrial and financial income into land diversified wealth across different economic behaviors. Financial assets responded to markets. Land responded to time. Agriculture followed seasons. Forestry followed decades. Together, these systems reduced overall volatility, even if they reduced peak profitability. Labor economics reinforced this stability. Rural regions offered abundant labor with limited alternative employment. Large estates could dominate local labor markets, setting terms that favored predictability over competition. Wages flowed out, but much of that money returned through rents, estate-controlled services, and local commerce aligned with the estate's interests. From a systems perspective, payroll was partially internalized, turning a major expense into a mechanism for recycling cash. Tax policy further strengthened this arrangement. Before the introduction of the federal income tax, recurring claims on wealth were modest. Property taxes existed, but they were small relative to industrial income. Holding wealth and land did not trigger continuous fiscal drag. Estate planning emphasized continuity rather than minimization. Under these conditions, converting money into land was not merely symbolic. It was efficient. Prestige played a quieter but critical role. Ownership of a large estate signaled permanence and discipline to peers, lenders, and political actors. In an era when trust was personal and reputational, this mattered. The mansion functioned as reputational collateral, reinforcing confidence in the broader financial structures that produced its funding. The appearance of stability supported the reality of cash flow, creating a feedback loop between perception and finance. It is important to emphasize that estates were never expected to replace the industrial engines that financed them. They were designed to stabilize and legitimize surplus, not to generate it independently. As long as railroads paid dividends, utilities collected fees, and extractive industries produced steady returns, the mansion's internal economics appeared sound. Costs were covered quietly. Inefficiencies were tolerated. The estate felt as though it was paying for itself because the upstream systems were large enough to absorb its demands without strain. This dependency would become visible only when those upstream systems slowed, fragmented, or came under new pressure. Understanding how the money was made clarifies why the estate model felt durable at first and why its vulnerability was not immediately apparent. If you want to see how this externally generated, wealth was deliberately engineered into a self-contained financial system on the ground. Let me know, and I'll continue. Once the money had been made and redirected into land, the central question facing America's wealthiest families was no longer how to build a mansion, but how to make that mansion behave economically. The guiding assumption was not that the estate would rival industrial investments and profitability, but that it could be engineered to reduce financial friction, stabilize long-term costs, and gradually offset its own existence. In this phase, the mansion ceased to be a static object and became a managed system, designed to function with internal logic rather than constant external support. At estates, such as Biltmore Estate, this logic was expressed through deliberate integration. Land was not acquired simply for privacy or status. It was assembled to support production at multiple levels, each one intended to substitute for market transactions. Agriculture provided food for the household and workforce, converting labor into consumption rather than cash expense. Dairy operations reduced reliance on external suppliers. Orchards, gardens, and livestock operations were planned around predictability rather than yield maximization, ensuring that basic needs could be met internally regardless of price fluctuations elsewhere. Forestry extended this system across longer horizons. Timber was treated less as a commodity and more as a financial reserve. Selective harvesting allowed managers to monetize growth when conditions were favorable while preserving the underlying asset. Unlike annual crops, forests represented deferred income, value stored in biological time rather than financial instruments. This approach aligned with the estate's broader goal of smoothing cash flow across decades rather than quarters. Income did not need to be constant. It needed to be available when required. Labor was structured to reinforce internal circulation. Large estates employed hundreds of workers across farming, forestry, maintenance, and domestic service, many of whom lived on estate-owned land. Housing, utilities, and services were often tied to employment, creating a semi-contained labor ecosystem. Wages paid out did not immediately leave the system. They returned through rents, estate-run stores, and local commerce shaped by the estate's presence. From a financial perspective, payroll became partially self-recycling, reducing leakage and volatility. Administrative control bound these elements together. Operations were coordinated through centralized management that aligned planting schedules, maintenance cycles, and staffing levels. Decisions were made with an emphasis on predictability, rather than optimization. The mansion itself functioned as the administrative core, housing records, offices, and logistical infrastructure that allowed disparate activities to operate as a single system. Architecture served governance as much as comfort, reinforcing the estate's role as an operating entity rather than a passive asset. Prestige economics operated alongside these tangible mechanisms, hosting influential visitors, demonstrating modern management practices, and projecting order produced indirect financial benefits. Social capital lowered transaction costs elsewhere, facilitated access to credit, and reinforced political goodwill. In an era when trust was personal and institutional oversight was limited, this reputational stability mattered. The estate's visibility supported the external income streams that continued to subsidize its operations. Vertical integration completed the design. Workshops, storage facilities, and specialized staff reduced dependence on external contractors and suppliers. Repairs could be handled in-house. Materials could be sourced on-site. Adjustments could be made without waiting for market solutions. This increased fixed costs, but reduced uncertainty, a trade-off that made sense in an economy where external markets were volatile and internal coordination was comparatively cheap. Crucially, the estate was never expected to succeed in isolation. Its financial logic assumed continued support from industrial and financial income generated elsewhere. The goal was not profitability, but resilience. As long as external cash flows remained strong, the estate's internal system could absorb inefficiencies without threatening overall wealth. This separation between operational performance and survival is what made mansions feel as though they were paying for themselves. Costs existed, but they were buffered by a larger financial ecosystem that made those costs seem manageable. For a time, this design worked. The estate operated smoothly, expenses were predictable, and the mansion appeared to function as a self-contained economic unit. Money flowed in, circulated internally, and rarely demanded attention. The system felt stable enough to justify its scale. Yet this stability depended on assumptions about labor, taxation, and capital mobility that would not hold indefinitely. The same integration that reduced volatility also increased rigidity. The same scale that stabilized costs amplified their impact. Understanding how the mansion was turned into a financial system is essential because it explains why later pressures proved so destabilizing. If you want to understand how the hidden costs of this system gradually undermined the belief that these estates could pay for themselves, let me know and I'll continue. The idea that America's richest mansions could eventually pay for themselves depended on a quiet assumption that the systems designed to stabilize costs would not themselves become sources of accelerating expense. For a time, this assumption appeared reasonable. But as estates matured, the financial engine that once smoothed volatility began to accumulate friction. At properties such as Biltmore Estate, the hidden costs were not the result of extravagance or neglect. They were the predictable outcome of scale, permanence, and bespoke complexity. Maintenance was the most relentless of these costs. A mansion of extraordinary size was not a finished object, but a living system that required constant intervention. Stonework shifted with temperature and moisture. Roofs demanded continual inspection and repair. Drainage systems required vigilance to prevent water intrusion that could compromise entire wings. Interior finishes aged under daily use by hundreds of occupants and staff. Because nearly every component was custom-built, repairs could not be standardized or outsourced cheaply. Each task required specialized labor, turning routine upkeep into a permanent, high-cost obligation. Mechanical infrastructure compounded this burden. Early heating, plumbing, and power systems were advanced for their time, but they aged poorly as expectations of comfort and efficiency evolved. Retrofitting was expensive and disruptive, often risking damage to the structure itself. Leaving systems unchanged increased fuel consumption and labor requirements year after year. Small inefficiencies multiplied across vast square footage, converting innovation into inertia. What once symbolized modernity became a source of escalating operating expense. Labor, initially a stabilizing input, hardened into a fixed cost structure. Estates relied on skilled workers familiar with unique systems that could not be easily replaced, reducing staff risk, operational failure, yet retaining them required ongoing expenditure regardless of output. Beyond wages, housing, utilities, food provision, and supervision added layers of cost that persisted even during periods of reduced activity. Over time, payroll shifted from a partially internalized loop into a rigid obligation resistant to adjustment. The land itself carried underestimated costs. Agricultural operations required continual investment in equipment, livestock, and soil management. Forestry demanded road maintenance, replanting, and long periods during which capital remained tied up without immediate return. Fences, outbuildings, and internal transportation networks expanded the maintenance footprint far beyond the mansion. Each additional acre increased prestige, but it also multiplied obligations that could not be easily shed without undermining the system's coherence. Administrative complexity added another layer of friction. Coordinating farming, forestry, maintenance, and household operations required layers of management that did not directly produce output. Decision-making slowed as systems became more interconnected and inefficiencies became harder to isolate. Improvements in one area often raised costs in another, creating trade-offs that reduced overall efficiency. Integration, once a source of stability, became a constraint on adaptation. Opportunity cost operated quietly in the background. Capital locked into land, buildings, and internal infrastructure could not be redeployed as financial markets matured and offered higher returns with greater liquidity. While estates preserved value, they did not compound it at the pace of newer instruments. Over decades, this divergence mattered. Wealth that might have grown elsewhere was instead consumed by the effort required to keep the estate unchanged. Social expectations impose their own expenses. Maintaining the appearance of effortless permanence required continuous spending on presentation, hospitality, and conformity to elite norms. These costs were difficult to reduce without diminishing prestige, yet they generated no direct financial return. The estate had to look stable even as the resources required to sustain that image increased. Individually, none of these costs threatened immediate failure. Collectively, they narrowed the margin for error. The mansion no longer needed to collapse dramatically to disprove the idea that it could pay for itself. It needed only to exist in an environment where costs rose faster than the external income streams that had once absorbed them without scrutiny. Scale, which had once insulated the system, now magnified every inefficiency and reduced flexibility. By the time these hidden costs were fully recognized, the belief that estates could sustain themselves had already begun to erode. The financial engine still ran, but it required increasing inputs simply to maintain equilibrium. If you want to see how broader economic shifts finally pushed this model past its breaking point, let me know and I'll continue. The moment when America's richest mansions stopped plausibly paying for themselves did not arrive as a sudden failure. It arrived as a narrowing of margins so gradual that, for years, it could be mistaken for temporary strain. The estate model had been engineered for a world in which taxation was light, labor was local and weakly regulated, capital moved slowly, and political scrutiny of private wealth was limited. When those conditions shifted together, the financial logic that once made self-sustaining estates seem reasonable began to unravel. At properties such as Biltmore Estate, the breaking point was not a crisis of management, but a crisis of alignment. Fiscal change was the most direct pressure. The introduction of the federal income tax in 1913 transformed private wealth from something episodically assessed into something continuously measured. Industrial and financial income that had once flowed almost entirely into reinvestment or long-term planning now faced recurring claims. Progressive taxation magnified this effect, and the later introduction of estate and inheritance taxes altered the intergenerational assumptions that had justified holding vast, illiquid properties. The estate's permanence, once a virtue, made valuation straightforward and avoidance difficult. Each year, scale translated directly into fiscal obligation. Labor economics reinforced this pressure. Industrial expansion and urbanization broadened employment opportunities, weakening the estate's dominance over local labor markets. At the same time, labor standards formalized expectations around wages, hours, and working conditions. Arrangements that had once relied on paternalism and limited alternatives became subject to regulation and oversight. Compliance raised costs and reduced discretion, turning labor from a stabilizing input into a rising fixed commitment. The estate could no longer internalize payroll cheaply, nor could it easily reduce staff without risking operational failure. Market integration further destabilized the model. Agricultural prices became more volatile as national and international markets synchronized, eroding the predictability that estate farming depended on. Timber markets followed cycles that rarely aligned with the estate's cash needs, weakening forestry's role as a stabilizer. Meanwhile, financial markets matured, offering liquid instruments that combined diversification with returns that outpaced land-based operations. In comparison, estates appeared increasingly inefficient, tying up capital and assets that demanded continuous expenditure simply to maintain parity. Social and political attitudes toward concentrated wealth also shifted. Large private estates, once regarded as symbols of order and progress, increasingly attracted skepticism. This change did not dismantle estates directly, but it reshaped the policy environment. Support for regulation and redistribution grew, reducing the informal protections that prestige had once provided. Visibility, which had functioned as reputational collateral, became a source of exposure. The cumulative effect of these forces was margin compression. Operating costs rose steadily, while the estate's relative contribution to overall wealth declined. External income streams that had once subsidized inefficiencies faced their own constraints, narrowing the buffer that made the estate feel autonomous. The system did not collapse. It inverted. What had been designed to stabilize wealth now required stabilization itself. This was the true breaking point. The belief that the mansion could eventually pay for itself depended on an environment that no longer existed. Adjustments at the margins could delay consequences, but they could not restore coherence between scale and context without abandoning the estate's defining characteristics. The mansion still stood, operations continued, and outward appearances changed little. But the financial premise that justified its scale had quietly expired. If you want to see how this loss of alignment turned power into liability and forced estates into a fundamentally different role, let me know and I'll continue. Once the belief that America's richest mansions could pay for themselves collapsed, the estates entered a phase defined not by sudden failure, but by constrained choice. The financial engine that had once promised stability now imposed obligations that narrowed options and amplified risk. At estates such as Biltmore Estate, power did not vanish, it inverted. What had once protected wealth now demanded continuous justification simply to be maintained. The most immediate expression of this inversion was cash flow pressure. The internal systems designed to reduce expenses continued to operate, but their output no longer matched the costs required to sustain them. Maintenance schedules could not be paused without risking structural damage. Labor commitments could not be reduced without compromising safety and functionality. Energy consumption rose as aging systems required more input for the same level of comfort. The estate moved from a posture of optimization to one of preservation, where the primary financial goal was preventing decline rather than generating value. Incremental cost-cutting exposed the limits of scale. Reducing staff lowered payroll but increased operational fragility, as fewer workers meant slower maintenance cycles and greater wear on bespoke infrastructure. Deferred repairs conserved cash in the short term but created the risk of cascading failures with far higher future costs. Each decision traded one liability for another, narrowing the path forward rather than restoring balance. The very integration that had once stabilized the system now made selective retreat difficult. Land, long regarded as the ultimate reserve, became a store of trapped capital. Selling parcels provided liquidity but weakened the internal coherence that justified the estate's design. Agricultural and forestry operations lost scale, raising per-unit costs and reducing flexibility. Over time, divestment addressed immediate pressures at the expense of long-term resilience, converting strategic assets into tactical solutions that eroded the estate's original logic. The estate's relationship with its surrounding economy also shifted, where it had once dominated local labor markets and commerce, increasingly operated within competitive environments. Workers gained alternatives, suppliers demanded market terms, and local dependence diminished. Informal advantages of influence and centrality faded, replaced by explicit cash costs that could not be negotiated away. Size no longer conferred leverage. It magnified exposure. The most consequential change, however, was conceptual. The mansion ceased to be evaluated primarily as a private financial system and began to be understood as an asset whose value lay outside production. Historical significance, cultural interest, and public curiosity emerged as alternative sources of revenue. Opening estates, too. Visitors converted prestige into income, transforming attention into cash flow at a moment when traditional operations could no longer justify the scale of expenditure. This was adaptation rather than capitulation, but it marked the end of the original premise that the estate could sustain itself privately. Public access introduced new constraints. Staffing requirements increased. Regulatory compliance intensified, and where accelerated. Revenue became sensitive to broader economic cycles, particularly downturns that reduced discretionary spending. Yet this transition offered continuity that private funding alone could no longer guarantee. The mansion no longer reduced dependency on the outside world. It survived by engaging with it. Power persisted, but in altered form. Authority gave way to stewardship. Exclusivity was replaced by managed relevance. Decisions increasingly prioritized preservation over accumulation and sustainability over dominance. The estate remained impressive, but its role within the wealth structures that had created it was fundamentally transformed. This phase reveals the final paradox of a self-paying mansion. It endured not because its original financial logic remained intact, but because that logic was abandoned. Survival was achieved by surrendering autonomy, and continuity by accepting limits. If you want to understand why this model cannot realistically return in modern capitalism, let me know, and I'll continue. By the time America's richest mansions completed their transition from private financial systems to managed institutions, the economic conditions that had once made self-paying estates plausible were no longer recoverable. The disappearance of the model was not a matter of fashion or cultural preference. It was the consequence of structural changes that permanently altered how capital moves, how risk is priced, and how large, visible assets are treated within modern capitalism. What failed was not ambition, but compatibility. The most decisive change concerns capital mobility. In the era that produced estates like Biltmore Estate, wealth moved slowly and unevenly. Exiting large positions was costly, information traveled imperfectly, and physical control over land and infrastructure conferred durable advantage. Under those conditions, converting surplus into land-based systems reduced uncertainty. Today, capital is liquid, global, and continuously repriced. Wealth can be reallocated across asset classes and jurisdictions with speed and precision. Concentrating enormous resources into a single immobile estate is no longer conservative. It is strategically restrictive. Taxation reinforces this incompatibility. Modern fiscal systems are designed to identify, value, and tax large physical assets on a recurring basis. Property taxes, income taxes, inheritance taxes, and compliance costs apply regardless of whether an estate generates sufficient cash flow to justify its scale. Visibility no longer provides informal protection. It creates measurable exposure. Where permanence once shielded wealth, it now attracts ongoing obligation that compounds over time. Labor economics further prevent a return to the old model. The semi-contained labor ecosystems that allowed estates to internalize payroll depended on limited worker mobility and weak regulation. Those conditions no longer exist. Labor now commands market wages, legal protections, and geographic freedom. Internalizing labor at scale increases fixed costs without delivering the stability it once provided. What was once a hedge against volatility has become a source of it. Prestige has also inverted its financial function. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, permanence and territorial dominance signaled legitimacy and discipline. Today, prestige flows from adaptability, innovation, and network position. Monumental private estates no longer reduce perceived risk. They invite scrutiny, regulation, and social pressure. The reputational return on visibility has declined, while the reputational cost has increased. Modern attempts to recreate estate-based wealth systems illustrate this shift clearly. Large properties are now designed from inception as businesses structured around tourism, hospitality, branding, or institutional partnerships. These ventures can succeed, but they operate under fundamentally different logic. They require constant market engagement, continuous reinvestment, and sensitivity to consumer demand. The original model assumed continuity without adaptation. Contemporary capitalism penalizes that assumption. The contrast between old money and new money strategies underscores the point. Old money sought to anchor wealth in place, converting abstract capital into physical systems that could be managed across generations. New money prioritizes optionality. It disperses assets, maintains liquidity, and avoids structures with high fixed costs and limited exit paths. Where estates once converted wealth into control, they now convert wealth into constraint. What survives of the self-paying mansion model is therefore historical rather than strategic. These estates endure as cultural assets, educational sites, and managed enterprises, not as templates for modern wealth preservation. They mark the outer boundary of what private capital could once build under conditions of light regulation, constrained labor, and land-based legitimacy. That boundary has moved, and it has not moved back. Understanding why this model cannot return matters because it clarifies the real lesson beneath nostalgia. The estates did not fail because their owners lacked foresight. They became obsolete because the environment that rewarded their logic disappeared. Capital did not abandon scale. It abandoned immobility. If you want to bring this story together and extract the broader economic lesson it holds for wealth today, let me know and I'll continue. When the full arc of America's richest mansions is viewed through a financial lens, the story resolves into a lesson about alignment rather than extravagance. Estates like Biltmore Estate were not built because their owners misunderstood money, nor did they struggle later because they spent without restraint. They rose because their structures matched the economic environment of their time, and they faltered because that environment changed in ways that made the same structures increasingly costly to hold. At their peak, these mansions functioned as stabilizers of surplus capital. They translated volatile industrial and financial income into land, labor systems, and long-duration assets that behaved slowly and predictably. In an era of frequent financial panics, weak regulation, and limited institutional safeguards, This slowness was protective. Illiquidity reduced exposure to sudden shocks. Scale internalized risk. Control substituted for diversification. The estate did not need to outperform markets. It needed to dampen uncertainty while legitimizing wealth in physical form. This is why the belief that these estates could pay for themselves was both sincere and defensible. They did not generate extraordinary profits in isolation, but they conserved money by reducing leakage. Food production lowered household expenses. Forestry deferred income. Into the future, wages circulated locally and partially returned through rents and services tied to the estate. Most importantly, the estate absorbed surplus that might otherwise have remained. Exposed to market volatility. As long as upstream industrial engines produced abundant cash flow, the mansion's internal inefficiencies remained tolerable and often invisible. What ultimately failed was not the mansion, but the assumptions embedded within it. As taxation became systematic, labor markets opened, capital mobility increased, and financial instruments matured, the comparative advantage of land-based wealth collapsed. The same permanence that once protected capital became a magnet for recurring costs and scrutiny. The same scale that once smoothed volatility magnified. Rigidity. The estate did not suddenly become poorly managed. It became misaligned with the world around it. This distinction matters because it reframes decline as structural rather than personal. Old money did not lose discipline. It lost an environment that rewarded permanence and control. The transition from private financial system to managed institution was not an admission of failure. It was an adaptation to new constraints. By opening estates to the public, partnering with institutions, and prioritizing preservation over accumulation, owners exchanged autonomy for continuity. Wealth stopped flowing through the estate. The estate endured by changing what it was for. The broader lesson extends beyond historic mansions. Every era produces assets that appear unassailable. Within their own context, they reflect prevailing beliefs about stability, risk, and the future of capital. Over time, those beliefs are tested by structural change. Assets that can adapt survive. With their purpose intact, assets built for permanence often survive only by being reframed. The self-paying mansion teaches that durability is not the same as sustainability, and that preservation is often the final phase of systems built for accumulation. Modern wealth operates on a different logic. It prioritizes flexibility over monumentality, dispersion over concentration, and exit over permanence. This does not make the old model foolish. It makes it historical. Estates like Biltmore endure because they accepted the inversion of their original purpose and adapted to a world that no longer rewards the conditions that created them. The financial lesson is therefore simple and demanding. Wealth lasts not by building the largest structures, but by recognizing when structures have stopped serving their original economic function. If you want to keep exploring how capital builds systems, outgrows them, and learns to move on, consider subscribing and continuing this long-term conversation with the mansion economy.